This war, which was supposed to be over by last Christmas, celebrates its first birthday this week. In just 12 months, we've seen the advent of weapons of horror like the flamethrower and poison gas, we've seen submarines intentionally torpedo civilians, and we've seen new fronts spring up pretty much every month. And now it seems the people at home have had enough, for there were stirrings of revolution in the air. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week in Poland, the Germans beat back the Russians on two sides of Warsaw, and the Great Russian Retreat both there and between the Bug and Vistula rivers had led to a scorched earth policy that would create millions of refugees. The Western Front was static. The Italians tried again and failed to break through the Austrian lines at the Isonzo River, and at Gallipoli, disease was becoming a major issue. Something that also happened last week, but was happening every week, was the ongoing Armenian genocide in eastern Anatolia. Now, on the 27th, the Ottoman Imperial Army forced the Russians back near Mush, but Mush had been in the headlines all month, since throughout the month, thousands of Armenians had been massacred in the region. But though news of these massacres caused great indignation among the Allies, it was becoming obvious by now that all restraints were easing on all sides. For Britain was preparing to use poison gas in its next offensive, and the Kaiser took back his earlier orders not to bomb residential areas of London. As impossible as it seems, the war was getting even uglier. Look at what was happening on the Western Front this week, and you'll see it even more. One of the micro battles that basically happened every day on the stalemate of the Western Front was this week at Hooge. This was a battle for a mine crater, which had been created during an earlier British assault on the German trenches. Now, mine craters were big prizes because they gave shelter to whoever captured them, and a pretty well-protected place from which to fire on the enemy. The attack began on the 29th, and the Germans used their heavy mortar shells, the Minenwerfer, later known as the Minis by the British. These shells not only blew people to pieces, but the power of the explosions was so terrific that several men of the attacking battalion were sent back behind the lines in a state of gibbering helplessness. Well, that was on the 29th. On the 30th, the Germans used flamethrowers on the British. Way back in February, the Germans had experimented with flamethrowers in battle, though ineffectively. But at Hooge, the burning jets of gasoline were devastating. Lieutenant G.V. Carey wrote, "There was a sudden hissing sound, and a bright crimson glare over the crater turned the whole scene red. As I looked, I saw 3 or 4 jets of flame, like a line of powerful fire hoses, spraying fire instead of water, shoot across my fire trench. The men caught in the blast of the fire were never seen again." That was the morning attack. In the afternoon, the British attacked again, going over the top at 3 o'clock and being cut to pieces by the machine guns that they hadn't had time to locate. It was a complete, agonizing failure, and all for a hole in the ground. But while the action in the West might be micro, it was certainly macro in the East. In fear of possible invasion, Russia evacuated the factories in both Riga and Warsaw on the 25th. On the 27th, Warsaw was attacked on 3 sides. On the 28th, the German army crossed the Vistula between Warsaw and Ivangorod. On the 29th, the Lublin-Kelm railway, vital for the Russians, was finally cut by Austro-German forces. And on the 30th, the Russians fell back along the entire line as the evacuation of Warsaw continued and the Austro-Hungarian army occupied Lublin. The Russians had steadily been losing territory for 3 solid months since German General August von Mackensen kicked off the Gorlice-Tarnov offensive, and now that a second offensive was beginning far to the north, it seemed like it would only get worse. And just imagine the effect it had on the morale of the hopelessly outgunned and out-equipped soldiers. There were certainly those willing to step in and take advantage of the situation. This week, the Russian General Staff gave out to all Russian commanders a secret report about Bolshevik anti-war propaganda that was apparently being hidden in gifts sent from home. At this point, one Russian report says that superhuman efforts were required to keep the men in their trenches. And on the 30th, in Petrograd, General Poplivanov, the new Minister of War, warned that demoralization, surrender, and desertion are assuming huge proportions. Actually, on the 27th, James W. Gerard, the American ambassador in Berlin, told Washington that Germans were picking out the revolutionists and liberals from the many Russian prisoners of war, furnishing them with money and false passports and papers, and sending them back to Russia to stir up a revolution. But the idea of governmental change was not only Russian. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey had even said back on the 15th, "The continuation of the war must result in the overthrow of all existing forms of government." That's the Foreign Secretary saying that. And this week in Berlin, the New Fatherland League supported a declaration by 91 German intellectuals, including Albert Einstein, that pushed for a compromise peace with no annexed territories. When the League then did a mail-out of an anthology of statements by British pacifists like George Bernard Shaw and Bertrand Russell, the League's offices were raided and it was forced to cease all publications. Eventually, the League's existence was banned, but you could see the huge discontent that was spreading in the countries that had been at war the longest. This wasn't quite the case with Italy, though, who had only been at war for a couple of months and hadn't yet had time to suffer 1 million casualties or so. This week went well for the Italians as they advanced on the Lower Isonzo the 25th, occupied crests in the Julian Alps the 26th, captured the island of Pelagosa in the Adriatic that same day, and at the end of the week were making offensives in the Venetian Alps and Trentino. And in the Adriatic this week, the French destroyed an Austrian submarine supply station at Lagosta. It was an active week for subs. The American steamer Leelanau was torpedoed the 25th. This was a cargo ship, and there were fortunately no casualties, but on the 30th, the Leyland liner Iberia was torpedoed and an American citizen was killed. But since it had disregarded an order to stop and had tried to escape, the American State Department said it would take no action. And here are a few notes to round out the week. On the 25th, South Africa officially annexed German Southwest Africa. That same day in the Middle East, Nasiriyah was shelled, attacked, and occupied by British forces under General Göring. And the following day, Najd, in northeastern Arabia, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, announced its independence from the Ottoman Empire and put the garrison there to flight. And at the end of the week, 45 French planes bombed Freiburg and Pfalzburg as the war in the air continues to grow. So that's what was happening. The Germans closing in on Warsaw and Ivangorod as the Russians evacuate. The British being stopped from taking a hole in the ground by flamethrowers and high explosives. The Italians on the move and revolution in the air. But it had to come to that, right? Dreams of revolution, especially for Russia, who had already had one revolution in the past decade. Think, if you were in that army, an educated officer, watching hundreds of thousands of your comrades throw themselves against Austrian and German artillery again and again, armed only with bayonets or clubs, the lucky ones having a rifle. And all for what? Why were you fighting the Germans again? Because a Serb shot an Austrian a year ago? Did that make any sense to you? Did you still support your government? Your absolute ruler who sent you to fight? More and more often, the answer was no, as despair grew and grew. The war was exactly a year old, with no end in sight. You were reduced to torching your own country just to survive, and all you had left were your dreams of a future where you finally had control of your own destiny. Happy birthday, Great War. If you're new to our show or want to catch up on the events of the past 12 months, you can watch our playlist of special recap episodes right here. Now, 12 months of the war, of course, means that our channel and our show also celebrate their birthday with this episode. We've come a long way, and we could not have done it without you all, so thank you very much for your ongoing support. You guys are an awesome community. I love the comments. As somebody wrote, this is the only channel on YouTube where the comments don't suck, and that might not be entirely true, but I love the comments from you guys. I love that we're making this fantastic interactive documentary, and I'm really looking forward to the next 12 months with you all. You guys want to come here and say thank you to everybody? So guys, long as we're doing this episode.
Thank you.
Okay, Tony,
thank you,
Flo,
guys.
David.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Don't forget to subscribe and tell all your friends about us. We'll see you, well, for a long time coming. All right, see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.